Hi, I'm Marcus. My stepfather called me worthless for 15 years, said I'd never amount to anything more than the dirt under his shoes. He built an empire while tearing me down, made millions while making sure I knew I was nothing. But when that empire crumbled and he lost everything, when the banks came calling and his world fell apart, there was only one person left who could save him, me, the same worthless kid he'd spent years destroying. What happened next will show you that sometimes the people who hurt us the most end up needing us the most. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain was hammering against the warehouse windows like angry fists, each drop exploding against the glass in a rhythm that matched my pounding headache. I stood in the break room of Mitchell's construction supply, staring at the coffee machine that had been broken for 3 weeks, wondering if I had enough quarters in my pocket for the vending machine down the hall. 22 years old, and this was my life, counting quarters for a stale sandwich, while my stepfather Richard lived in a mansion across town, probably sipping wine that cost more than my monthly rent. I'd been working at Mitchell's for 8 months now, loading trucks, managing inventory, doing whatever grunt work they threw my way. The pay was decent enough to keep me fed and housed in my studio apartment, but barely. Every morning I'd wake up at 5:30, shower in a bathroom so small I could touch both walls with my arms stretched out, and drive my beat-up Honda Civic to a job that reminded me every day how far I was from the life I'd once imagined for myself. Richard Blackwood. That name carried weight in Phoenix, Arizona. Real estate developer, construction mogul, the kind of man who shook hands with mayors and had his picture in the business section of the newspaper. Blackwood Enterprises had its fingers in everything, from luxury condos to shopping centers, and Richard stood at the center of it all like a king surveying his domain. He'd married my mother when I was 7, and from day one he made it clear that I was an unwelcome addition to his perfectly planned life. My mother, Sarah, had been a single parent struggling to make ends meet when Richard swept into our lives like a hurricane of expensive suits and false promises. She worked 2 jobs back then, cleaning offices at night and answering phones at a dental practice during the day. I barely saw her, but when I did, she was exhausted, worn down by the constant struggle to keep us afloat. When Richard appeared with his luxury car and talk of giving us a better life, she fell for it completely. I was just a kid, but even then, something about him made my skin crawl. The wedding was small, just a handful of people at the courthouse, but to my mother, it might as well have been a fairy tale. Richard smiled for the photos, played the part of the loving stepfather, but I caught the way he looked at me when he thought no one was watching, like I was a stain on his perfect new life that he couldn't quite scrub away. We moved into his house in Scottsdale, a sprawling monument to success with marble floors and a swimming pool that reflected the Arizona sun like a mirror. My mother was in heaven, finally living the life she'd dreamed of. But for me, it was the beginning of a nightmare that would last 15 years. Richard never hit me. He was too smart for that, too concerned with his image to leave marks that people might see. Instead, he found other ways to make sure I knew exactly where I stood in his world. The verbal cuts came daily, delivered with the precision of a surgeon and the coldness of a snake. I was stupid, worthless, a burden that he'd generously taken on for my mother's sake. I'd never amount to anything, never be successful, never be the kind of man who mattered. At first, my mother would defend me, but as the years passed, her resistance weakened. Richard had a way of making everything seem reasonable, of twisting situations until even she began to believe that maybe I really was the problem. When my grades slipped in middle school, it wasn't because I was struggling to adjust to a new home and a stepfather who despised me. It was because I was lazy, unmotivated, destined for failure. When I got into a fight at school defending a kid who was being bullied, I wasn't standing up for someone weaker. I was violent, undisciplined, a troublemaker who would never learn respect. The psychological warfare was constant and expertly executed. Richard would wait until my mother was out of earshot, then deliver his poison with a smile. He'd criticize everything from the way I walked to the way I breathed, always with that same calm, reasonable tone that made me question whether I was overreacting. He had a gift for making me feel small without ever raising his voice, for crushing my spirit while maintaining the facade of a concerned stepfather, just trying to help me become a better person. High school was supposed to be my escape, but Richard made sure that even my successes felt hollow. When I made the varsity soccer team as a sophomore, he attended exactly one game, spent the entire time on his phone, and left before it was over. When I brought home a report card with straight A's, he glanced at it for half a second and said maybe now I'd finally learned how to do the bare minimum expected of me. Every achievement was diminished, every failure magnified, until I began to believe that maybe he was right about me. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My mother had changed too. The woman who used to work 2 jobs to support us had become someone I barely recognized. She spent her days shopping, getting her nails done, attending charity luncheons with the other wealthy wives. She'd found her place in Richard's world, and I was a reminder of the life she'd left behind. When I tried to talk to her about how Richard treated me, she'd sigh and tell me I needed to try harder to get along with him, that he was providing for us, that I should be grateful. Grateful. That word became a weapon in their arsenal. I should be grateful for the roof over my head, grateful for the food on my plate, grateful that Richard had chosen to take on the burden of raising another man's son. Never mind that I'd never asked for any of it. Never mind that the price of his generosity was my self-worth. I was supposed to smile and say thank you, while he systematically destroyed any confidence I might have had. The worst part wasn't the constant criticism, or the way he made me feel invisible at family gatherings. The worst part was watching my mother slip away from me day by day, year by year, until she became a stranger wearing my mother's face. She'd chosen her side, and it wasn't mine. By the time I turned 18, I was counting the days until I could leave. College had been my dream, my escape plan, and I'd worked my ass off to make it happen. I'd applied to state schools, community colleges, anywhere that would take me and offer financial aid. When the acceptance letters started arriving, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. That hope lasted exactly 1 week. I was in my room, surrounded by college brochures and scholarship applications, when Richard knocked on my door. He entered without waiting for permission, as he always did, and stood there with that familiar expression of mild disappointment that I'd learned to dread. He'd been looking into my college plans, he said, and he was concerned, not about my grades or my potential, but about the financial burden I'd be placing on the family. College was expensive, and while he'd always been generous in supporting me, there were limits to his charity. He'd done the math, and between tuition, room and board, books and living expenses, my education would cost more than he felt comfortable investing in such an uncertain return. The words hit me like physical blows. He wasn't forbidding me from going to college. He was just making it clear that I'd be on my own. No financial support, no co-signing on loans, no help of any kind. I could pursue my dreams if I wanted, but I'd have to do it without him, and by extension, without my mother. I spent that night researching student loans, work-study programs, anything that might make college possible without their help. But the numbers didn't add up. I could cover tuition with loans and grants, but living expenses were another matter entirely. I'd need a job, probably multiple jobs, and even then it would be a struggle that might take me 6 or 7 years to complete a 4-year degree. Richard knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't stopping me from going to college. He was just making it so difficult that failure was almost guaranteed. And when I inevitably struggled or dropped out, he'd be there to remind me that he'd warned me about biting off more than I could chew, that maybe I should have been more realistic about my limitations. I tried working part-time while taking classes at the local community college, but it was a losing battle. Between work and school, I had no time to study, no time to rest, no time to be anything more than a zombie stumbling through each day. My grades suffered, my health suffered, and my spirit cracked a little more each week. After 2 semesters, I made the decision that still haunts me. I dropped out. Richard's reaction was everything I'd expected and more. He didn't gloat, didn't say "I told you so." He just nodded with that same expression of mild disappointment and said maybe now I'd learned something about the difference between dreams and reality. My mother patted my shoulder and said there was no shame in knowing your limitations, that not everyone was cut out for higher education. The construction job came through a friend of a friend, someone who knew someone who needed warm bodies to carry materials and operate machinery. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid better than retail or food service, and I was desperate for something that might lead somewhere. I told myself it was temporary, just a way to save money and figure out my next move. But temporary had a way of becoming permanent when you didn't have other options. Mitchell's Construction Supply was a small operation compared to the companies Richard dealt with, but they were honest, hard-working people who treated their employees with respect. Tom Mitchell, the owner, was a guy who'd built his business from nothing, working 18-hour days until he could afford to hire help. He saw something in me that Richard never had, some potential worth nurturing, and within a few months he'd promoted me from general laborer to inventory manager. The work was satisfying in a way I hadn't expected. There was something honest about building things, about taking raw materials and turning them into something useful and lasting. I learned to read blueprints, to understand the different grades of steel and concrete, to spot problems before they became disasters. For the first time in years, I felt competent, valuable, like I was contributing something meaningful to the world. But Richard's voice was always there in the back of my mind, reminding me that this was exactly what he'd predicted. Manual labor, working with my hands because I wasn't smart enough to work with my mind. He never said it directly, but I could see it in his eyes whenever I ran into him around town. That look of confirmation, of prophecy fulfilled, of a man who'd been proven right about my limitations. The worst encounters happened when I'd see him at construction sites where Blackwood Enterprises was the general contractor. He'd be there in his expensive suit, reviewing plans with architects and engineers, while I'd be delivering materials in my company uniform with dirt under my fingernails. He'd nod politely if our paths crossed, maybe ask how I was doing in that tone reserved for distant acquaintances, but I could feel the satisfaction radiating from him like heat from a furnace. My relationship with my mother had become a series of awkward phone calls and obligatory holiday visits. She'd ask about my job in the same tone someone might ask about a chronic illness, with sympathy and a faint note of embarrassment. She loved me, I knew that, but she was ashamed of what I'd become, of how far I'd fallen from the expectations she'd once had. When Richard's friends asked about her son, she'd change the subject or mention my job in vague terms that made it sound more important than it was. The studio apartment I'd rented was in a complex that had seen better days, with thin walls and thinner bank accounts among the residents. But it was mine, the first space I'd ever had that belonged entirely to me, where I could think and breathe without Richard's presence suffocating every moment. I'd furnished it with pieces from thrift stores and garage sales, creating a life that was modest but honest, simple but free. I'd been at Mitchell's for almost a year when Tom called me into his office on a Thursday afternoon. He looked tired, older than his 50-something years, and there were papers scattered across his desk in a way that suggested he'd been wrestling with numbers that wouldn't cooperate. He'd been thinking about expansion, he said, maybe opening a second location or branching into retail sales. The construction industry in Phoenix was booming, new developments going up every month, and there was money to be made if a person was smart about it. He'd been watching my work, liked my attention to detail, and my ability to anticipate problems before they happened. He was wondering if I might be interested in learning the business side of things, maybe taking on more responsibility in exchange for a piece of the profits. The offer caught me completely off guard. For so long, I'd been focused on just getting through each day, on surviving rather than thriving, that I'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone believe in my potential. Tom was offering me something Richard never had, a chance to prove myself, to build something meaningful, to become the kind of man who mattered. I accepted on the spot, probably too quickly, but I couldn't help myself. For the first time since high school, I felt like I was moving forward instead of just treading water. Tom smiled and shook my hand, telling me we'd start with the books, learning how the money flowed in and out of the business, understanding profit margins and overhead costs, and all the details that separated successful companies from failed ones. Over the next few months, I threw myself into learning everything I could about the business. I stayed late studying invoices and purchase orders, came in early to meet with suppliers and contractors, spent weekends researching industry trends and new technologies. Tom was a patient teacher, explaining concepts that seemed obvious to him but were revolutionary to me, showing me how to read between the lines of financial statements and customer complaints. The more I learned, the more I realized how much I'd been underestimating myself. I had a head for numbers, an intuitive understanding of logistics, a talent for seeing patterns and connections that others missed. Maybe Richard had been wrong about me. Maybe I wasn't destined for failure after all. The first real test came when one of our biggest customers, a mid-sized construction company, was threatening to take their business elsewhere because of repeated delivery delays. Tom was ready to write them off, figuring the relationship was damaged beyond repair, but I asked for a chance to fix it. I spent 3 days analyzing their orders, mapping their project timelines, identifying the bottlenecks in our delivery system that were causing the delays. The solution was simpler than anyone had expected. By adjusting our delivery schedule and partnering with a third-party logistics company for rush orders, we could cut their wait times by 60% while actually reducing our costs. I presented the plan to Tom and the customer in a meeting that felt like the most important hour of my life, explaining the changes with charts and graphs that I'd stayed up all night preparing. It worked. The customer not only stayed with us but increased their orders, and word spread through the industry about our improved service. Tom was impressed, maybe even a little surprised, and he started giving me more autonomy in managing customer relationships and operational improvements. But success brought its own challenges. The better I got at my job, the more visible I became in the local construction community, and that meant more opportunities to cross paths with Richard and his world. I'd see him at industry events, networking with the same customers I was trying to serve, moving through crowds of contractors and developers like he owned them all. He never acknowledged me at these events, never introduced me to his associates as his stepson or even as someone he knew. I was invisible to him in public, just another worker in an industry he dominated. But I could feel him watching sometimes, evaluating, measuring my progress against his predictions of my failure. The night everything changed started like any other. I was working late at the office, reviewing purchase orders for a big residential development project, when Tom knocked on my door. He looked different, excited in a way I'd rarely seen, and he was carrying a manila folder thick with documents. He'd been contacted by a developer about a massive project, he said, the kind of contract that could transform our little company into a major player in the Phoenix market. A luxury resort and casino complex on the outskirts of the city, requiring millions of dollars worth of materials and equipment over an 18-month construction timeline. The profit potential was enormous, but so was the risk. We'd need to expand our staff, lease additional warehouse space, establish credit lines with new suppliers. It was a bet-the-company proposition. I spent the weekend reviewing the proposal, running numbers, researching the development company and their track record. Everything looked legitimate, profitable, exciting, This was the kind of opportunity that could change everything, that could prove once and for all that I was capable of more than Richard had ever imagined. Monday morning, I gave Tom my recommendation we should bid on the contract. He smiled and said he'd been hoping I'd say that, and we spent the next 2 weeks preparing the most comprehensive proposal Mitchell's construction supply had ever submitted. We calculated costs down to the penny, planned logistics with military precision, and presented a bid that was competitive but profitable. When we got the contract, Tom actually whooped with joy, spinning around the office like a kid who'd just won the lottery. This was it, he said, our big break, the project that would put us on the map. We celebrated with beer and pizza in the warehouse, just the two of us and the handful of employees who'd helped put the proposal together. I should have been ecstatic, but something nagged at me as I read through the contract details. The timeline was aggressive, the penalties for delays were severe, and some of the payment terms seemed unusual. But Tom was so excited, so confident that we could handle anything, that I pushed my concerns aside and focused on the opportunity ahead of us. The first few months went smoothly. We hired additional staff, leased a second warehouse, established relationships with new suppliers. The money was flowing in faster than we'd ever seen, and Tom started talking about opening offices in other cities, maybe even franchising the business model. I found myself working 14-hour days, managing multiple crews, coordinating deliveries that required military-level precision. But somewhere around month 4, things started to go wrong. Deliveries were delayed, suppliers were changing terms without notice, and the development company was slow to approve change orders that we needed to keep the project on schedule. What had started as minor hiccups became major problems, and the aggressive timeline that had seemed challenging but manageable began to look impossible. I worked weekends trying to solve the logistics puzzles, called suppliers at all hours trying to secure materials, and gradually watched our profit margins disappear as we paid overtime to crews working around the clock to meet deadlines. Tom remained optimistic, convinced that we just needed to push through the rough patch, but I could see the numbers deteriorating week by week. The crisis came on a Tuesday morning in October. I arrived at the office to find Tom on the phone, his face pale, his voice strained. When he hung up, he just stared at the wall for a long moment before turning to me with eyes that looked decades older than they had the day before. The development company was pulling out of the project. Market conditions, financing issues, regulatory problems. They had a dozen excuses, but the bottom line was simple. They were cancelling the contract effective immediately. All work was to stop. All materials were to remain on site pending further instructions, and all outstanding invoices would be paid according to the termination clause in the contract. I grabbed the contract and flipped to the termination section, reading the fine print that I'd glossed over in my excitement months earlier. My stomach dropped as I realized what we were facing. The termination clause was brutal, designed to protect the developer at the expense of subcontractors like us. We'd be paid for completed work, but not for materials on site, not for equipment rentals, not for the crews we'd hired specifically for this project. Tom and I spent the next 3 days with calculators and legal pads, trying to figure out how much we were going to lose. The numbers were catastrophic. Between the materials we'd purchased, the equipment we'd leased, and the staff we'd hired, we were looking at losses that would wipe out not just the profits from the resort project, but everything we'd built over the years. Mitchell's construction supply was going under, and it was partially my fault. I'd pushed for the contract, helped design the expansion, convinced Tom that we could handle the risk. My first real chance to prove Richard wrong, and I'd managed to destroy a good man's life's work in the process. Tom never blamed me, not once, but I could see the weight of failure crushing him day by day. We laid off the new employees, cancelled the lease on the second warehouse, sold equipment at a fraction of what we'd paid for it. Within 6 weeks, Mitchell's construction supply went from being a growing success story to being a cautionary tale about the dangers of overextension. The day Tom closed the doors for the last time, He shook my hand and told me I had real talent, that this failure didn't define me any more than any single success would have. He was moving to Colorado to live with his daughter, starting over at an age when most men were thinking about retirement. He wished me luck and said he hoped our paths would cross again, someday under better circumstances. I stood in the empty warehouse that night, surrounded by the ghosts of ambition and the wreckage of dreams, and felt Richard's voice echoing in my head louder than ever. This was what happened when people like me tried to reach beyond their limitations. This was the inevitable result of forgetting my place in the natural order of things. I was 22 years old, unemployed, and carrying a burden of guilt that felt heavier than any physical load I'd ever lifted. The studio apartment that had once felt like freedom now felt like a cell, and every job application I filled out felt like an admission of defeat. Richard had been right about me all along. I was worthless, destined for failure, incapable of being anything more than a disappointment to everyone who'd ever believed in me. What I didn't know, as I sat in that empty warehouse contemplating the ruins of my first real chance at success, was that 30 miles away in his Scottsdale mansion, Richard Blackwood was facing his own reckoning. The empire he'd built, the success he'd used as a weapon against me for 15 years, was crumbling faster than anyone could have imagined. And soon, very soon, the man who'd spent my entire life telling me I was worthless would discover that sometimes the people we destroy are the only ones left to save us. 6 months of unemployment had turned my savings account into a joke and my confidence into dust. I'd applied to every construction company in Phoenix, answered ads for warehouse work, retail positions, anything that might pay enough to keep the lights on. The responses were always the same polite rejections or complete silence. Word traveled fast in the construction industry, and somehow the story of Mitchell's collapse had attached itself to my name like a scarlet letter. I was down to my last $200 when I finally swallowed my pride and took a job at a big box home improvement store. The pay was barely above minimum wage, the hours were inconsistent, and the work consisted mainly of helping weekend warriors find the right screws for their deck projects. It was honest work, but it felt like falling off a cliff after the responsibility and respect I'd earned at Mitchell's. The worst part wasn't the pay cut or the mind-numbing routine. It was the uniform. Every morning I'd put on that orange vest and name tag, and I'd see Richard's smirking face in the mirror, hear his voice reminding me that this was my natural level, the place I'd always been destined to end up. He'd been right about my limitations all along. 3 weeks into the job, I was helping a customer load drywall into his truck when I heard a familiar voice behind me. Rich, confident, the kind of voice that expected immediate attention and usually got it. I turned around slowly, dreading what I'd see, and there he was. Richard Blackwood, standing in the contractor supplies aisle like he owned the place, which in a way I supposed he did. He was talking to one of the store managers about a bulk order for one of his development projects, gesturing with the casual authority of a man who'd never been told no in his entire life. He looked older than I remembered, grey creeping into his dark hair, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there during my childhood. But he still carried himself like a king, still radiated that sense of absolute confidence that had always made me feel small. Our eyes met across the aisle, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. I saw recognition flicker across his face, followed by something that might have been satisfaction. Here I was, exactly where he'd always predicted I'd end up, wearing a retail uniform and loading building materials for people more successful than myself. He didn't acknowledge me directly, just gave the slightest nod before returning to his conversation with the manager. But I caught him glancing in my direction several times, and I knew he was savoring this moment, this confirmation of every harsh prediction he'd ever made about my future. When he left the store 20 minutes later, I felt like I'd been physically struck. All the progress I'd made in rebuilding my sense of self-worth evaporated in an instant. I was that scared kid again, worthless and small, destined for nothing more than serving people who mattered while I remained invisible. That night I called my mother for the first time in months. I didn't plan to tell her about seeing Richard or about how low I'd fallen. But somehow it all came spilling out. The failed business, the unemployment, the retail job that barely covered my rent. I heard the disappointment in her voice, the familiar tone that suggested she'd expected this outcome all along. She listened without interrupting, making small, sympathetic sounds that somehow made me feel worse instead of better. When I finished, there was a long pause before she spoke. Richard had mentioned seeing me at the store, she said. He was concerned about my situation, thought maybe I could benefit from some guidance about realistic career goals. The word realistic hit me like a physical blow. Even now, even after I'd proven myself capable of real responsibility and achievement, they still saw me as someone who needed to lower his expectations, to accept limitations that they'd imposed, rather than any that actually existed. I ended the call quickly, claiming I had to get ready for work the next day. But I spent the rest of the night sitting on my couch, staring at the wall, wondering if maybe they were right. Maybe I was delusional for thinking I could be anything more than what I was. Maybe Richard's assessment of my worth had been accurate all along. The next few months passed in a haze of routine and resignation. I went to work, helped customers, collected my paycheck, and tried not to think about the future that seemed to be shrinking smaller every day. I stopped reading industry publications, stopped networking with former colleagues, stopped believing that anything would ever change. It was during this dark period that I met Jessica Martinez. She was a contractor who came into the store regularly, a woman in her early 30s who ran her own renovation business specializing in historic home restorations. Unlike most of the contractors who treated retail employees like invisible servants, Jessica actually talked to me like I was a human being. She'd noticed my knowledge about materials and construction techniques, the way I could recommend solutions instead of just locating products on shelves. During one of her visits, she mentioned that she was looking for someone with real construction experience to help manage her projects. The pay wasn't amazing, but it was better than retail, and it would get me back into the industry where I belonged. I almost said no. The voice in my head, Richard's voice, whispered that I'd just fail again, that I'd disappoint another person who'd made the mistake of believing in me. But something about Jessica's straightforward manner, her obvious competence and success, made me want to try. Maybe this was my chance to prove that the Mitchells' failure had been bad luck rather than inevitable destiny. Jessica's operation was small but efficient. She specialized in renovating century-old homes in Phoenix's historic districts, projects that required both technical skill and historical sensitivity. The work was challenging in ways I'd never experienced, requiring research into period-appropriate materials and techniques, coordination with historical preservation societies, attention to details that most contractors ignored. I started as a project coordinator, managing schedules and materials for 3 ongoing renovations. The work was complex but satisfying, and I found myself learning constantly, researching historical building methods, tracking down specialized suppliers, solving problems that required both creativity and technical knowledge. Jessica was a good boss, demanding but fair, and she seemed genuinely impressed with my organizational skills and industry knowledge. Within 2 months, she'd promoted me to project manager, giving me responsibility for entire renovations from planning through completion. For the first time since Mitchell's closed, I felt like I was building something meaningful again. The breakthrough came on a project that should have been routine. We were renovating a 1920s bungalow in the Roosevelt Historic District, a charming home that had been neglected for decades. The owner wanted to restore it to period accuracy while adding modern conveniences, a challenging balance that required extensive research and careful planning. 3 weeks into the project, we discovered that the previous owners had made structural modifications that weren't documented in any of the permits or architectural drawings. Load-bearing walls had been removed, support beams had been relocated, and the entire second floor was essentially held up by good intentions and blind luck. Most contractors would have called the city inspector and dumped the problem back on the homeowner. The costs to fix the structural issues properly would have been enormous, probably more than the house was worth. But I spent the weekend researching historical building codes and consulting with structural engineers, looking for a solution that would preserve the home's character while ensuring its safety. The answer came from an unexpected source. I found records of similar renovations done in the 1940s, when materials were scarce and contractors had to be creative. By combining period-appropriate techniques with modern materials, we could reinforce the structure without destroying the home's historic integrity. The solution was elegant, cost-effective, and completely in keeping with the house's character. Jessica was amazed. She'd expected to lose money on the project, but my solution actually came in under budget while exceeding the owner's expectations. More importantly, word spread through the historic preservation community about our innovative approach to structural problems. Within weeks, we had more inquiries than we could handle. That success led to bigger projects, more complex challenges, and eventually to Jessica offering me a partnership in the business. She wanted to expand beyond single-family homes into commercial historic renovations, projects that would require more capital and expertise but offered much higher profit potential. I accepted immediately, probably too quickly, but I couldn't help myself. This was my chance to build something real, something that mattered, something that would prove once and for all that Richard had been wrong about my potential. We renamed the company Heritage Restoration Partners and began bidding on larger projects. Historic office buildings, old warehouses being converted to lofts, even a 19th-century church that was being transformed into a community center. The work was challenging and rewarding, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. Success brought visibility, and visibility brought attention from the broader Phoenix business community. I found myself attending the same industry events where I'd once felt invisible, but now I was there as an equal, as someone whose opinion mattered. Contractors who'd never returned my calls when I was unemployed were suddenly interested in collaboration. The first time I saw Richard at one of these events, I almost turned around and left. He was holding court near the bar, surrounded by the usual crowd of developers and city officials, radiating that same sense of ownership and control that had always intimidated me. But something had changed. I wasn't the frightened kid anymore, or the desperate job seeker. I was a successful business owner with my own reputation and accomplishments. He noticed me across the room, and our eyes met for the second time in 2 years. But this time, instead of satisfaction, I saw something else in his expression. Surprise, maybe even concern. I nodded politely and turned back to my conversation with a potential client, but I felt his eyes on me for the rest of the evening. The growth of Heritage Restoration Partners was steady but dramatic. Within a year, we'd gone from a 2-person operation to a team of 12, with projects throughout Arizona and inquiries from California and New Mexico. The historic preservation niche had turned out to be more profitable than anyone had expected, and we were positioning ourselves as the regional experts in complex restoration work. My personal life was improving too. The studio apartment had been replaced by a house in a neighborhood that wasn't fancy, but was clean and safe. I'd bought a reliable truck, started dating a teacher named Linda, who appreciated my passion for preservation work, and began to believe that maybe I really could build a life worth living. But success in construction is always precarious, dependent on economic cycles and market forces beyond any individual's control. The first signs of trouble came in the form of cancelled projects and delayed payments. Developers who'd been eager to restore historic properties suddenly discovered that new construction was cheaper and faster. Banks that had been happy to finance preservation projects began questioning their long-term value. Jessica and I watched our pipeline shrink week by week as clients postponed projects or cancelled contracts altogether. The mortgage crisis was beginning to ripple through the economy, and construction was always the first industry to feel the impact. We tried to adapt, bidding on smaller projects, expanding into regular renovation work, but the competition was fierce and the margins were thin. The real blow came when our biggest client, a development company that had hired us to restore an entire block of historic buildings downtown, declared bankruptcy 3 months into the project. We'd already purchased materials, hired specialized craftsmen, committed resources that we couldn't easily redirect. The bankruptcy court proceedings would take months, and we'd be lucky to recover 50 cents on every dollar we were owed. Jessica and I spent sleepless nights running numbers, trying to figure out how to keep the company afloat. We laid off most of our staff, sold equipment, took out personal loans to cover payroll for the remaining employees. But the math was unforgiving. Without the downtown project payment, Heritage Restoration Partners was heading for the same fate that had claimed Mitchell's construction supply. I found myself reliving the same nightmare that had destroyed Tom's business, watching another company I cared about crumble despite our best efforts. The irony was bitter. I'd finally proven that I could succeed, could build something meaningful and profitable, only to watch it destroyed by forces completely outside my control. The night Jessica and I made the decision to close the company, we sat in our empty office, surrounded by architectural drawings and project photos, the remnants of 2 years of hard work and hope. She was remarkably gracious about the whole thing, pointing out that we'd accomplished more than most small businesses ever did, that the failure was economic rather than operational. But I felt the familiar weight of Richard's voice in my head, reminding me that this was what happened when people like me tried to reach beyond their natural limitations. Twice now, I'd been involved in business failures. Twice I'd watched good people lose their investments because they'd trusted me with responsibility I couldn't handle. The liquidation process took 3 months, during which I had to face former employees, disappointed clients and creditors who wanted to know how a seemingly successful company had collapsed so quickly. Each conversation felt like a confession of inadequacy, proof that Richard's assessment of my worth had been accurate all along. By the time Heritage Restoration Partners officially closed its doors, I was 26 years old and unemployed for the second time in 4 years. The house was gone, sold to cover business debts. The truck was gone, repossessed when I couldn't make the payments. Linda was gone too, not because she blamed me for the business failure, but because I'd become someone she didn't recognize, bitter and withdrawn and convinced that anything I touched would eventually turn to ash. I moved back into another studio apartment, this one even smaller and more depressing than the first. The walls were thin enough that I could hear every conversation, every argument, every late-night phone call from my neighbors. It felt like living inside other people's lives while having none of my own. The job search was even more difficult this time. 2 failed businesses in 4 years made me look like either unlucky or incompetent, and most employers couldn't tell the difference. I applied for everything from construction work to office jobs to driving delivery trucks, but the responses were consistently negative. The economy was tightening everywhere, and companies could afford to be choosy about who they hired. I was 6 weeks behind on rent and facing eviction when I finally found work with a janitorial service that cleaned office buildings downtown. The pay was minimum wage, the hours were overnight, and the work was everything I'd ever feared about being trapped in dead-end employment. But it was income, barely enough to keep me housed and fed while I continued looking for something better. The worst part of the janitorial job wasn't the low pay or the antisocial hours. It was the buildings I cleaned, modern office towers and restored historic buildings, the kind of projects I'd once managed and coordinated, now reduced to emptying trash cans and mopping floors. I'd see architectural details I'd researched, restoration work I'd supervised, and feel like a ghost haunting my own former life. 3 months into the janitorial job, I was cleaning offices in one of downtown Phoenix's most prestigious business towers when I saw a familiar name on a directory board. Blackwood Enterprises occupied floors 12 through 15, a massive footprint that spoke to the company's continued growth and success. Richard's empire was apparently thriving, while I scraped gum off the undersides of desks. I avoided those floors for weeks, afraid of accidentally encountering Richard or someone who might recognize me. But eventually curiosity got the better of caution, and one night I found myself standing outside the Blackwood Enterprises reception area, looking through glass doors at the kind of success I'd once dreamed of achieving. The offices were impressive even by downtown standards. Expensive furniture, original artwork, floor-to-ceiling windows with views of the entire Phoenix metropolitan area. This was the world Richard inhabited, the level of success he'd achieved, while simultaneously ensuring that I'd never come close to reaching it myself. I was turning to leave when I heard voices from one of the conference rooms. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see Richard inside with several other men, all wearing expensive suits and serious expressions. They were reviewing documents spread across a large table, their voices low and urgent. I should have walked away immediately. I had no business eavesdropping on private meetings, and if I'd been caught, I would have lost the only job I could find. But something about their tone, the tension in their voices, made me pause and listen. Richard was explaining something about cash flow problems and delayed payments from major clients. One of the other men was asking pointed questions about debt service and loan covenants, the kind of financial terminology I'd learned during my brief partnership with Jessica. A third voice mentioned bankruptcy attorneys and asset protection strategies. I listened for maybe 2 minutes before the implications became clear. Blackwood Enterprises, the mighty empire that had cast such a long shadow over my entire life, was in serious financial trouble. The man who'd spent 15 years telling me I was worthless was facing the same kind of business collapse that had destroyed every venture I'd ever been part of. I finished my cleaning duties that night in a daze, my mind racing with questions and possibilities. If Blackwood Enterprises was really in trouble, if Richard's success was as fragile as it appeared, then everything I'd believed about his superiority and my inadequacy might be fundamentally wrong. Over the next few weeks, I made excuses to work late in that building, hoping to overhear more conversations or glimpse more documents. What I learned painted a picture of a company that had grown too fast, taken on too much debt, and bet everything on a real estate market that was beginning to crumble. Richard had leveraged every asset, borrowed against every property, and committed to projects that required a level of sustained growth that was no longer sustainable. The same aggressive expansion strategy that had built his empire was now threatening to destroy it, and he was running out of options to prevent a complete collapse. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unlikely source. One of my fellow janitors, an older man named Carlos, who'd been cleaning offices for 20 years, mentioned that he'd worked in the Blackwood building before and knew some of the employees. According to Carlos, half the staff had been laid off in the past 6 months. Projects were being cancelled daily, and there were rumors that Richard was desperately looking for investors or partners to help save the company. I went home that night and spent hours researching Blackwood Enterprises online, reading news articles and financial reports that confirmed what I'd suspected. The company was hemorrhaging money, facing multiple lawsuits from contractors and lenders, and Richard was rapidly approaching the same fate that had claimed Mitchell's Construction Supply and Heritage Restoration Partners. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. The man who'd spent my entire life predicting my failure was now facing the exact same kind of business collapse that had defined my career. But unlike me, Richard had no experience with failure, no practice in picking up the pieces and starting over. He'd built his entire identity around success and dominance, and when that foundation cracked, he had nothing left to stand on. I should have felt vindicated, or at least satisfied, to learn that Richard's empire was crumbling. But instead I felt something unexpected: sympathy. I knew what it was like to watch something you'd built fall apart despite your best efforts. I understood the crushing weight of failure, the way it made you question everything you'd ever believed about yourself. 2 weeks later, everything changed. I was finishing my shift in the Blackwood building when the elevator doors opened and Richard stepped out. He looked haggard, older than his years, carrying himself with none of the confidence I remembered. Our eyes met, and for a moment neither of us moved. He looked at my janitorial uniform, my ID badge, my cart full of cleaning supplies, and I saw something I'd never seen before in his expression: recognition, not just of who I was, but of what I represented. I was living proof that failure wasn't fatal, that it was possible to survive even when everything you'd built came crashing down. We stood there in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then Richard did something that shocked me more than anything else that had happened in my entire life. He nodded respectfully, almost apologetically, and walked past me toward his office without saying a word. But I could see in his eyes that he finally understood what I'd learned years earlier. Success and failure were often separated by nothing more than luck and timing, and the people we dismiss as worthless might be the only ones who truly understand what it means to lose everything and keep going. The next morning, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end was unmistakable. Richard Blackwood was calling me, and for the first time in my life, he needed something from me more than I needed anything from him. Richard's voice on the phone sounded different than I'd ever heard it before. Not the commanding tone that had dominated every conversation of my childhood, but something smaller, more human. He asked if we could meet for coffee, said he had a business proposition that might be mutually beneficial. The words felt strange coming from him, almost like he was speaking a foreign language. I agreed to meet him at a diner near downtown, partly out of curiosity, and partly because I wanted to see Richard Blackwood humble himself in person. The man who'd spent 15 years telling me I was worthless was now asking for my time, and I wasn't going to pass up the opportunity to witness his desperation firsthand. He was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with his back to the wall, wearing a suit that looked expensive but somehow diminished on his frame. The confidence that had always radiated from him like heat was gone, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like fear. He stood when he saw me, extended his hand for a shake, and I realized that this might be the first time he'd ever treated me as an equal. We ordered coffee and sat in awkward silence for several minutes, neither of us quite sure how to begin a conversation that existed outside the familiar patterns of dominance and submission. Richard kept adjusting his tie, checking his phone, doing anything to avoid making direct eye contact. Finally, he cleared his throat and launched into what sounded like a prepared speech. Blackwood Enterprises was facing some temporary cash flow challenges, he said, the kind of short-term difficulties that all successful companies experience during economic downturns. He had several major projects in development that would return the company to profitability, but he needed someone with operational expertise to help manage the transition. Someone who understood construction from the ground up, who could maximize efficiency and minimize waste. I listened without interrupting, recognizing the corporate euphemisms for what they really meant. Temporary cash flow challenges meant the company was broke. Major projects in development meant he was scrambling to find work. Operational expertise meant he needed someone desperate enough to work for promises instead of paychecks. When he finished his pitch, he leaned back and waited for my response, trying to project confidence but failing completely. I could see the desperation in his eyes, the knowledge that I was probably his last hope for saving everything he'd built. The irony was so perfect it almost made me laugh. I told him I'd need to see the company's financial statements before making any decisions. Real numbers, not the sanitized summaries he showed investors. I wanted to understand exactly how dire the situation was, what assets remained, and whether there was any realistic chance of recovery. If I was going to help him, it would be on my terms, not his. Richard's face tightened at my demands. the old authoritarian impulse flashing across his features before being replaced by resigned acceptance. He agreed to provide complete financial transparency, promised access to all records and accounts, even offered to put me on the payroll immediately as a consultant. I turned down the payroll offer. If I was going to do this, it wouldn't be as his employee. It would be as a partner with equity in the company and decision-making authority over operations. I'd seen too many desperate business owners make promises they couldn't keep, and I wasn't going to be another casualty of Richard's financial mismanagement. The negotiations took 3 weeks, during which I continued working my janitorial job while reviewing Blackwood's books in the evenings. What I found was worse than I'd expected. The company wasn't just struggling, it was technically insolvent, kept alive only by creative accounting and the willingness of a few remaining creditors to delay their demands for payment. Richard had borrowed against every asset, mortgaged every property, and committed to contracts that required upfront payments the company no longer had. The payroll was 3 weeks behind, vendors were demanding cash on delivery, and the bank was threatening to call in loans that couldn't be repaid. Blackwood Enterprises was a zombie company, walking around but already dead. But buried in the financial wreckage, I found something interesting. 3 development projects that were almost complete. Properties that could be sold quickly if someone was willing to take a loss on the construction costs. The sales wouldn't be enough to save the company, but they might provide enough cash to negotiate with creditors and buy time for a restructuring plan. I presented my analysis to Richard in his office, the same space where I'd eavesdropped on his desperate conversations weeks earlier. He listened with growing amazement as I outlined a survival strategy that could keep Blackwood Enterprises alive, at least temporarily. Sell the nearly completed projects at cost, use the proceeds to negotiate payment plans with major creditors, and focus all remaining resources on one large development that was still in the planning stages. The plan required significant sacrifices. Richard would have to give up his salary, sell his personal assets to fund operations, and accept a minority ownership position in the restructured company. Essentially, he'd have to surrender control of everything he'd built in exchange for a chance to keep it from disappearing entirely. I expected him to reject the proposal, to insist that there had to be another way that didn't require him to admit failure or relinquish power. But Richard surprised me. He agreed to every condition, signed documents that reduced his ownership to 30%, and handed over operational control of the company that had defined his entire adult life. The transition was brutal for both of us. I moved from cleaning Richard's building to running it, from emptying trash cans to making decisions that affected dozens of employees and millions of dollars in assets. The learning curve was steep, and every day brought new crises that required immediate attention. The first challenge was stopping the financial bleeding. I called meetings with every major creditor, explaining the situation honestly and proposing payment schedules that were aggressive but realistic. Some vendors wrote off their losses and walked away, but others agreed to modified terms in exchange for guarantees of future business. The employee situation was more complex. Most of the experienced staff had already been laid off, leaving behind a skeleton crew of young architects and project managers who were talented but inexperienced. I had to rebuild the team while training people to handle responsibilities they'd never faced before. Richard struggled with his new role more than I'd anticipated. For 15 years, he'd been the undisputed authority figure, the man whose word was law and whose decisions were final. Now he was essentially an employee in his own company, dependent on my approval for major expenditures and strategic changes. The psychological adjustment was clearly painful, but he never complained or tried to undermine my authority. The relationship between us was strange and uncomfortable, built on mutual need rather than trust or affection. We maintained professional courtesy during business hours, but the personal history between us hung over every interaction like a toxic cloud. I could see him struggling to reconcile the worthless stepson he'd tormented with the competent executive who was now saving his company. The first major success came 4 months into the restructuring. We managed to complete and sell 2 of the development projects, generating enough cash to pay down the most pressing debts and restore some credibility with lenders. The sales prices were disappointingly low, but they proved that Blackwood Enterprises could still deliver completed projects on time and within budget. More importantly, the successful sales attracted the attention of a larger development company that was looking for local partners. Phoenix Development Group had been watching Blackwood's situation, waiting to see if we could stabilize operations before proposing a partnership arrangement. They offered to provide financing for our largest remaining project in exchange for a significant equity stake and management oversight. The Phoenix development deal was exactly what we needed to ensure long-term survival, but it would further dilute Richard's ownership and reduce his influence even more. I presented the terms to him expecting resistance, but he signed the agreement without hesitation. His empire was gone, but at least his company would survive. The partnership with Phoenix Development transformed Blackwood Enterprises from a failing construction company into a stable, mid-sized operation with steady revenues and manageable debt levels. We were no longer the dominant force Richard had built, but we were profitable and growing modestly. Most of the original employees had been hired back, and we were bidding on projects throughout Arizona. My own position evolved as the company stabilized. I was no longer just the crisis manager brought in to prevent bankruptcy, but the operational leader of a successful business. Phoenix Development had offered me a permanent role as regional manager, with compensation that reflected my contributions to the turnaround. For the first time in my life, I was financially secure and professionally respected. But the most significant change was in my relationship with Richard. The power dynamic that had defined our entire history had been completely reversed. He was now dependent on my goodwill and professional competence, while I held the authority to make decisions that affected his financial future. The irony was almost too perfect, except that I found no satisfaction in his reduced circumstances. Watching Richard adjust to his new reality was like observing someone learn to walk again after a devastating injury. The arrogance and certainty that had once made him so intimidating were gone, replaced by a kind of cautious humility that seemed foreign on his features. He asked for my opinion on matters where he'd once issued orders, deferred to my judgment on decisions he'd once made unilaterally. The breakthrough in our personal relationship came during a particularly stressful week when a major client was threatening to cancel a contract over design changes that would add significantly to the project cost. Richard and I were working late, reviewing alternative solutions, when he suddenly stopped talking and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. He apologized. Not for the current crisis, but for everything. For the years of psychological abuse, for the systematic destruction of my confidence, for the way he'd made me believe I was worthless when I was actually capable of remarkable things. The words came slowly, painfully, as if each one cost him something precious. I didn't know how to respond. I'd imagined this moment for years, fantasized about the satisfaction I'd feel when Richard finally admitted he'd been wrong about me. But sitting in his office at midnight, watching this broken man struggle with the weight of his failures, I felt only exhaustion and a strange kind of pity. I accepted his apology without drama or celebration, simply acknowledging that we'd both learned things about ourselves that we hadn't expected. He nodded gratefully and returned to the design problem, but something fundamental had shifted between us. We were no longer stepfather and stepson locked in an eternal power struggle, but 2 adults who'd survived disasters that had taught them different lessons about resilience and worth. The resolution of the design crisis required compromise from both the client and our team, but we managed to save the contract and deliver the project successfully. More importantly, The way Richard and I worked together to solve the problem established a new pattern for our professional relationship. We were partners now, not equals exactly, but collaborators with different strengths and shared objectives. 6 months after the Phoenix Development Partnership was finalized, I was offered a promotion that would have taken me to their corporate headquarters in Denver. The salary increase was substantial, the responsibilities were exciting, and the opportunity for advancement was everything I'd ever wanted professionally. It was the kind of offer that validated all the hard work and sacrifice of the previous years. But accepting the promotion would have meant leaving Richard and the company in a precarious position. While Blackwood Enterprises was stable, it still required careful management and someone who understood both the construction industry and the specific challenges facing the business. Richard had made significant progress in adapting to his reduced role, but he wasn't ready to resume full operational control. I turned down the promotion, not out of loyalty to Richard or sentimentality about our shared history, but because I'd finally found work that challenged and fulfilled me. Blackwood Enterprises wasn't just a job anymore. It was a company I'd helped save and rebuild, a place where my decisions mattered and my contributions were valued. Richard's reaction to my decision was characteristically complex. He was clearly relieved that I wouldn't be abandoning the company, but he also seemed troubled by the sacrifice I was making for his benefit. We talked about it during one of our increasingly frequent dinners, conversations that would have been impossible during my childhood, but had become natural parts of our adult relationship. He understood why I'd made the choice, he said, but he wanted me to know that my future wasn't tied to his past mistakes. If I ever decided to leave Blackwood Enterprises, he'd support the decision and help me find opportunities that matched my talents and ambitions. The company would survive or fail based on its own merits, not on my sense of obligation to fix everything he'd broken. The conversation marked another milestone in our evolving relationship. Richard was releasing me from any responsibility for his failures while acknowledging that my success was independent of his approval or disapproval. The worthless stepson he'd spent years creating had been replaced by a competent adult whose achievements belonged entirely to himself. 2 years after taking control of Blackwood Enterprises, I stood in the same office where Richard had once held court like a corporate king, reviewing financial statements that showed steady profitability and sustainable growth. The company wasn't the empire it had once been, but it was healthy and stable, providing good jobs for 43 employees and generating profits that satisfied all stakeholders. Richard knocked on the door and entered with the respectful manner he'd developed since our roles reversed. He wanted to discuss his retirement plans, he said, his intention to step back from day-to-day operations and transfer his remaining ownership stake to me over the next 5 years. At 58, he was ready to find new challenges that didn't carry the weight of our complicated history. I listened to his proposal with mixed emotions. Part of me wanted to reject the offer, to prove that I didn't need his approval or his assets to be successful. But the rational part of my mind recognized that accepting his ownership stake would give me complete control over a company I'd essentially rebuilt from bankruptcy. It was a fair resolution to an impossible situation. We shook hands on the deal, and for the first time since I'd known him, Richard smiled at me with what looked like genuine pride. Not the condescending approval of a superior acknowledging adequate performance, but the respect of one professional recognizing another's accomplishments. That evening, I drove to my mother's house for the first time in over a year. She'd been trying to stay neutral during Richard's business crisis and my unexpected rise to prominence, but I could see the confusion in her eyes every time we spoke. The family dynamics she'd understood for 15 years had been completely upended, and she was struggling to process the new reality. She greeted me at the door with the kind of nervous enthusiasm she reserved for important guests, offering coffee and asking about work with genuine interest rather than polite concern. We sat in the living room, where I'd once been lectured about realistic expectations and the importance of knowing my limitations. and she listened as I explained the changes at Blackwood Enterprises and my plans for the company's future. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time, looking out the window at the swimming pool where I'd once been forbidden to swim without permission. Finally, she turned back to me with tears in her eyes and said she was proud of who I'd become, proud of the way I'd handled success and failure with equal grace, proud that I'd found the strength to help Richard when he needed it most. I thanked her for the kind words, but I also told her something I'd been thinking about for months. The person she was proud of wasn't someone who'd suddenly appeared when Richard's company failed. That person had always existed, had always been capable of achievement and leadership and success. The only thing that had changed was the circumstances that allowed those qualities to emerge. She nodded slowly, understanding finally sinking in. Richard's assessment of my worth had been wrong from the beginning, not because I'd changed or grown or proven myself worthy, but because worth wasn't something that could be determined by someone else's opinion. I'd always been valuable, always been capable, always been deserving of respect and opportunity. The conversation with my mother marked the final resolution of my childhood trauma, the last step in reclaiming an identity that had been stolen by years of systematic psychological abuse. I was no longer the worthless stepson who disappointed everyone who'd ever believed in him. I was Marcus Chen, successful business owner, respected professional, and survivor of circumstances that had taught me resilience rather than defeat. 6 months later, I received an invitation to speak at a business conference about crisis management and company turnarounds. The organizers had heard about the Blackwood Enterprises situation and wanted me to share insights about leading organizations through financial difficulties. It was the kind of professional recognition I'd dreamed about during my darkest moments of unemployment and self-doubt. I accepted the speaking engagement and spent weeks preparing a presentation that focused on the practical aspects of business restructuring rather than the personal drama of my relationship with Richard. But during the question and answer session, someone asked about the psychological challenges of taking control from a company's founder. And I found myself talking honestly about the complexities of success and failure, worth and worthlessness, and the ways people can surprise themselves when circumstances demand growth. After the conference, several audience members approached me with job offers and consulting opportunities. Phoenix Development wanted to discuss expanding our partnership into other markets. A business school invited me to teach a course on crisis management. A publisher asked if I'd be interested in writing a book about turning around failing companies. Each opportunity represented validation of abilities I'd spent years doubting, proof that Richard's assessment of my limitations had been fundamentally wrong. But more importantly, they demonstrated that success wasn't about proving others wrong or achieving revenge against people who'd hurt me. Success was about finding work that mattered, building relationships based on mutual respect, and creating value for everyone involved in the effort. Richard attended my conference presentation, sitting in the back row and applauding politely when I finished. Afterward, he congratulated me on the speech and said he'd learned things about business management that he planned to apply in his retirement consulting work. There was no trace of the man who'd once called me worthless, no echo of the stepfather who'd spent years ensuring I knew my place in his world. We shook hands outside the conference center, and I realized that our relationship had finally evolved into something healthy and sustainable. We weren't father and son, weren't even friends exactly, but we were two people who'd survived a shared catastrophe and learned to respect each other's contributions to the recovery. Richard would always carry the guilt of his treatment of me, and I would always remember the pain he'd caused, but neither of us was trapped by that history anymore. Today, 5 years after taking control of Blackwood Enterprises, I run a successful construction and development company that employs over 100 people and generates millions of dollars in annual revenue. Richard consults with struggling businesses, helping them avoid the mistakes that nearly destroyed his empire. My mother has rebuilt her relationship with both of us, accepting responsibility for her role in enabling the dysfunction while celebrating the healing that followed the crisis. The story doesn't have a perfect ending, because real life rarely does. Richard and I will never have the father-son relationship that might have been possible under different circumstances. I still carry scars from the psychological abuse of my childhood, and he still struggles with guilt over the damage he caused. But we've both learned that healing doesn't require forgetting the past, only refusing to let it define the future. The most important lesson from this experience isn't about revenge or vindication or the satisfaction of proving someone wrong. It's about the resilience of human potential, the way people can surprise themselves when they're given opportunities to demonstrate their true capabilities. Richard was wrong about my worth, but that wrongness didn't define my reality until I allowed it to. Sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones who end up needing our help. And sometimes the greatest victory isn't in their downfall, but in our ability to rise above the desire for revenge. Richard called me worthless for 15 years, but when his empire crumbled and he had nowhere else to turn, I became his only hope for salvation. The irony is perfect, but the real triumph is that I chose to help him anyway. Up next, you got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.